The unseen war. Elliot Harper's job as a security guard was the definition of monotonous. He'd sit in the same chair every night, watch the same cameras, and count down the hours until his shift ended. He didn't mind it, really. After years on the job, he had grown used to the routine. It was predictable, and predictability was something he'd learned to appreciate. But that all changed one night, and everything Elliot thought he knew about his quiet and remarkable life was turned upside down. It was a little after midnight, and Elliot was doing his usual rounds on the monitors, sipping on a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. The screens showed the same empty hallways, parking lots, and storage rooms they always did. He leaned back in his chair, eyes half closed, trying to stay awake. Then something caught his attention. At first, he thought it was a glitch, a flicker on the screen, like static. He straightened up and squinted at one of the monitors that showed a view of the north side parking lot. There, in the corner of the screen, a shadowy figure seemed to be moving. Elliot leaned in closer, trying to get a better look, but just as quickly as it appeared, the figure was gone. He rewound the footage and played it back, but there was nothing there, just an empty, dark parking lot. He shrugged it off, thinking maybe his tired eyes were playing tricks on him. But then it happened again, on another screen. This time, it was in the back corridor, near the loading dock, the same dark, indistinct figure. Elliot's heart skipped a beat. He watched, frozen, as the shadow moved across the screen, almost as if it was gliding. He reached for the rewind button, but the moment he pressed it, the figure disappeared from the recording entirely, as if it had never been there in the first place. Elliot's pulse quickened. He'd dealt with a share of petty thefts, trespassers, and even the occasional drunk wandering onto the property, but this was different. This was weird, and Elliot didn't like weird. Over the next few nights, the same thing happened. Shadows would flicker across the screens, sometimes one, sometimes several, but whenever he tried to replay the footage, they'd be gone. It was as if they only existed when he was watching live. After a week of this, Elliot was convinced he was either losing his mind or there was something seriously wrong with the cameras. Then, one night, everything escalated. Elliot was halfway through his shift when he saw not just one, but two shadowy figures, and this time, they weren't just drifting aimlessly. They were moving toward each other, fast, like they were about to collide. He watched, wide-eyed, as the shadows seemed to clash, their dark shapes twisting and writhing on the screen. For a moment, it almost looked like they were fighting, but not in a way Elliot had ever seen before. There were no punches, no kicks, just movements that were quick, sharp, and unnaturally fluid. He couldn't tear his eyes away. The shadows danced around each other, merging and then separating, like the black, smoky clouds locked in combat. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the screen went black. Elliot's heart pounded in his chest as he frantically tried to switch to another camera feed, but all of them had gone dark. He was left staring at a wall of blank monitors, the room eerily silent. The screens flickered back to life a few seconds later, and everything was as it had been: empty hallways, quiet parking lots, no shadows in sight. Elliot sat there, shaken, his mind racing. What the hell had he just seen? The next day, he did something he hadn't done in years. He talked to his supervisor. He tried to explain what he'd seen, but the man just gave him a skeptical look. "You sure you weren't just dozing off, Elliot?" he asked, barely hiding his smirk. Elliot didn't blame him. He wouldn't have believed it either, but Elliot wasn't about to let it go. That night, he brought his own camera to work, one with a battery backup that wasn't linked to the security system. He set it up in the corner of the room, aimed at the monitor that showed the parking lot. If the shadows showed up again, he'd have proof. Hours passed, and nothing happened. Elliot's eyelids felt heavy, and he fought to stay awake. Just when he was about to give up, he saw it, a shadow, creeping across the screen. Then another, and another. Elliot held his breath as the shadows moved closer to each other, circling, like they were sizing each other up. This time, the fight was even more intense. The shadows twisted and lunged, their movements chaotic but purposeful. It was like watching a storm in fast motion. Elliot grabbed his camera, hoping it was catching everything, when suddenly, the room filled with a low, humming sound. It was barely audible at first, but it grew louder, resonating in his chest. The shadows on the screen seemed to respond to the sound, their movements becoming more frenzied. And then, a voice, low, distant, like a whisper that echoed from far away. "You shouldn't be watching." Elliot jerked back, knocking over his coffee cup. The dark liquid spilled across the desk, but he barely noticed. He glanced around the room, expecting to see someone standing there, but he was alone. The shadows on the screen stopped moving, and for a moment, everything was still. Then, one of them turned, and though it was just a dark shape, Elliot had the unsettling feeling it was looking directly at him. The camera suddenly cut off, the screen went blank, and the low hum disappeared. Elliot's hands were shaking as he tried to get the camera back on, but it was dead. When the monitors flickered back on, the shadows were gone. Elliot didn't sleep at all that day. He watched the footage he'd recorded, hoping he'd caught something, anything, that would make sense of what he'd seen. But when he played it back, there was nothing but static. It was as if the shadows had wiped themselves from existence. The next night, Elliot came to work with more questions than answers, but before he could even sit down at his desk, someone was waiting for him, a man in a dark suit, his expression unreadable. "Elliot Harper?" the man said, and the way he said it sent a chill down Elliot's spine. "We need to talk." The man led him out of the room, down a corridor Elliot had never seen before, to a part of the building that shouldn't have existed. They stopped in front of a heavy metal door, and the man turned to Elliot with a grim smile. "You've seen more than you should," he said. "But you're not alone. There's a war happening, Elliot. One you were never supposed to know about. But now that you do, you're part of it." And before Elliot could protest, before he could even think of a way out, the door opened, and he was ushered inside. The shadows, it seemed, weren't just on the screens anymore.